This is going to be a pretty long video in which I demonstrate the first 3 rounds of the brioche two-color cowl. The first one I'm going to demonstrate is the setup round, and that is what you're going to do right after you're finished with the homework portion of your cowl. The homework was to cast on 80 stitches, switch to your smaller needle, and work knit 1, purl 1 around those 80 stitches. And so now we're going to start the actual brioching. And we're going to start with the same color that you have been using, so you don't need to join the second color yet. And this round is going to take you from just the regular old knit 1, purl 1 rib into something that can become the brioche rib. The brioche is a version of a rib, much, fancier. So first step, very easy. Here's my beginning of round marker. Knit that first stitch. And now comes the part of the instruction that causes a lot of trouble, because there are many steps, but they kind of all flow together. I'm going to bring the yarn to the front between the needles, and I am going to slip the next stitch as if to purl. And this stitch, you'll notice, was purled on the previous round. Take that stitch over to the right hand needle, and then bring the yarn over the needle in order to be in position to work a knit stitch. And that's the next stitch is a knit, and it was a knit on your regular ribbing round. And this is how it's set up to be brioche. You have a single stitch alternating with what you could think of as a double stitch or a twin stitch or a wrapped stitch. This is the yarn over going right over the slipped stitch. And that's how it's going to work. You're going to make the single stitches into these double stitches and the double stitches into these single stitches. That's how you're going to get the brioche pattern. So I'll start again. I just knit a stitch in the regular way, so yarn comes to the front. The next stitch is slipped as if to purl. Yarn goes over the needle, and I knit a stitch. Let me show you this with the yarn in my right hand. I think it's quite a different animal depending on which hand you hold the yarn in. So again, yarn comes to the front. Next stitch, which was purled in the row before, is slipped as if to purl. And in this case with the yarn in my right hand, the yarn is already kind of over the needle. I don't have to move it as much. Knit the next stitch. Yarn to the front. Slip as if to purl. Yarn just sort of stays in position, and you knit the next stitch, and by doing it that way, you've put the yarn over the stitch that you slipped. So yarn forward, slip as if to purl, knit. I'm going to keep going all the way around. Okay, here I am. Last 3 stitches of the round. Here's a purl, so the yarn comes forward. I slip that formerly purled stitch and knit that formerly knit stitch. And on the last stitch of the round, it's a purl, so it's one of those that I'm supposed to bring the yarn forward and slip. And the yarn is supposed to lay over that stitch, but you can see that there is nothing to connect it on its left side. It probably won't be in the right place when you come back to it, and that's, I think, the biggest trick to the success of this pattern is knowing what to expect here at the beginning of round. So we'll come back to that when I get all the way around again. But for the moment, I'm just going to leave it sort of dangling toward the back and hope for the best. And now it's round 1 of the proper brioche, and this is a brioche purl row. BRP, people will say burp, And then brioche knit is BRK. People will say bark. You can say whatever you want, but this is a brioche purl round, and I'm going to introduce my second color. This orange is what I'm calling my light color. It's a really good idea when you're starting out, for sure, to have some very contrasty colors. And even if they don't fit into the categories of light and dark, you can just remember how you assigned them. But if you have two colors that are hard to tell apart, you're going to really struggle more than you need to with this. So I've got the light yarn in my hand here. The dark yarn is still attached. You never cut your yarn with this. It always just stays attached. And the first step here is going to be to have the yarn, the working yarn, which is the new color, to the front and slip a stitch. And the way I do that is I hang on to a tail in the back. I'm just holding on to the yarn in the back, and I bring it to the front, just like it was, like it was already attached. Slip this stitch as if to purl. Even though it was a knit stitch, you're always slipping as if to purl in this technique. And now I need to brioche purl these next paired stitches, which means I will essentially purl them together. The yarn is to the front, but it needs to go all the way around the needle and come back to the front before I brioche purl, and that is so that I can twin this single stitch that I just slipped. And now I'm going to purl these two together, just in the normal way that you would purl two together. And on this brioche purl row, the yarn is already to the front. You don't need to move it to the front to do the next step. The yarn is in the front, so it's time to slip a stitch as if to purl. Take your yarn all the way around the needle and back to the front so that you're ready to brioche purl this next pair of stitches together. And then repeat again. So I'm going to hold the yarn like I would normally hold it if I was using my right hand. Yarn is in the front, so I slip the single stitch as if to purl. Yarn all the way around the needle, brioche purl the twinned stitches together. Yarn stays in the front, slip the single stitch, yarn travels all the way around the needle and back to the front in order to brioche purl the twin stitches. And now, if I was to hold the yarn in my left hand, this is how it would look. Yarn, again, is still in the front where it's supposed to be. Slip the single stitch, and when I hold the yarn in my left hand, I tend to use the needle more than my hand. I manipulate the needle more than I do my yarn. So I kind of pulled that stitch off, and as I twist the needle, I'm kind of bringing the yarn around the needle back to the front so that I can brioche purl these two together. The yarn is where it's supposed to be, in the front. Slip the single stitch, make it so that your yarn goes all the way around the needle, and brioche purl. Slip all the way around, brioche purl. I'm going to keep doing this until I get back to the beginning of round, and I will see you there. Alright, I am back at the beginning of the round, and you can see that the gray yarn I was using initially is trying to do its own thing. But we know, actually I'll back up one stitch here, it's easier to describe. We know that we've got a situation where a twin stitch is followed by a single stitch, which is followed by another twin stitch. So this is definitely a twin stitch, it's obvious. This has to be a single stitch, and it sure looks like one. This kind of looks like a single stitch, but it isn't. This is its twin. So my method for dealing with this is when I get to this point, I just put this yarn over where it's supposed to be. I just lay it over the needle, and then I make sure that I work these last stitches in the way that I should. So this is a twinned stitch on the needle. That means it's a brioche purl, purl two together. And this is a single stitch, so that means it's yarn forward and slip the stitch. Yarn comes all the way over the needle to brioche purl these next two together. Just make sure you get both of the strands. There's the stitch on the needle, that's no problem, and just kind of make sure that that tail gets involved as well. There. And now that you've done that, it's more secure. Plus, we're about to start the next round, which means I'm going to drop the color I was using, and in this case, it was a brioche purl round. I drop it to the front. That works the best for me. And here's this first color, which is what I'll use next, and it is kind of hanging to the back, so that's where I take it from. That's a good position for this because the first step here is going to be brioche knit. You can see you have a twin stitch, and now that you're using two colors, it's even easier to see the twin stitches because they involve one strand of each color. So that means these two need to be knit together, brioche knit. Then the yarn will come forward, and we will slip this single stitch as if to purl and take the yarn over it to create a new twin stitch. So right now, anything that's a twin stitch is going down to one stitch. Anything that's a single stitch is going up to twinned. So first step is brioche knit, which means knit these two strands together. And this first time it's a little weird because, again, you have something that's not attached on both sides, but now that will be that'll be easy to manage. Yarn to the front, slip your single stitch, let the yarn lay over the needle, and brioche knit the twinned stitches. Yarn to the front, slip your single stitch, let the yarn come over the needle, and knit the twin stitches. Switching hands, yarn to the front, slip the single stitch, and the yarn is just kind of laying in the right position when I have it in my right hand, and I just brioche knit the twin stitches. Yarn to the front, slip the single stitch, let the yarn come over the needle as you brioche knit the twin stitches. Yarn to the front, slip, let the yarn come over the needle and knit. And again, I will meet you back at the end of the round and show you how that looks. All right, almost there. I've got to brioche knit, yarn to the front, slip, brioche knit, and again I'm putting myself in that position where the last stitch is yarn to the front, slip, and I just lay the yarn over the top, and I'll know that I need to make sure that it's doing the right thing when I get back around to it. But for now, I leave that gray yarn, I pick up my orange yarn, and I am ready to work another brioche purl round. The orange yarn is already helpfully in the front where it needs to be because the first stitch you're faced with is a single one, and that means yarn must be to the front, and you will slip that single stitch, and then the yarn comes all the way around the needle and you brioche purl. And that is how to do your rounds. Those are the only two rounds. You're going to repeat those over and over. I'll do another video once I have an inch or so on this fabric so we can talk about landmarks you can look for. It's harder to tell what's going on at the beginning, which is the cruel thing about knitting all of these new techniques and patterns. It's the hardest for you to know what's going on right at the beginning when you need the most help knowing what's going on. But hopefully this video was helpful, and I hope you'll enjoy this technique and the result that you get.